Racist police detain Black grandmother, shocked when her true identity is revealed. Racist officers arrested a Black grandmother in front of her grandchildren, not realizing they had made a fatal mistake. Now they'll have to face the consequences. Make sure to subscribe for more, and let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? Grace Wilson adjusted her sun hat, smiling softly as she guided her two grandchildren, Emily and Josh, through the sliding glass doors of the airport. The children's excited chatter filled the air. It had been months since she had taken a break from her demanding job as a federal judge. This vacation was her opportunity to reconnect with her grandchildren and enjoy time away from courtrooms and legal battles. Grace had always cherished these moments, valuing every laugh, every conversation that gave her a glimpse into their young lives. They arrived at the check-in counter dragging their small suitcases behind them. Emily, always the curious one, kept looking up at the large airport screens displaying the flights. Josh, a bit more reserved, clutched his backpack tightly, his eyes wide with wonder. Grace leaned down and whispered, "What's the first thing we're doing when we land?" "Swimming," Emily beamed, jumping up and down. "And then we get ice cream, right, Grandma?" Josh added eagerly. "That's right," Grace replied warmly, her heart swelling with affection. These small moments with them were precious. She was determined to make this vacation perfect. At the check-in desk, a young woman greeted them with a polite but cautious smile. "Good afternoon, where are you headed today?" "To the Caribbean," Grace answered. Her tone was calm, professional, a habit she had developed over years in court. The agent's eyes flicked between Grace and the children, her expression tightening slightly. "And these two are?" Grace's smile didn't falter. "My grandchildren. We're going on vacation together." The woman hesitated, her brow furrowing. She typed something into the computer, then looked up again, a hint of skepticism now evident. "I just need to confirm, are you traveling with the parents?" "Permission." Grace's jaw tightened for a moment, though she kept her expression neutral. It wasn't the first time she had been questioned about her relationship with her grandchildren. She knew the look in the woman's eyes, a subtle but unmistakable doubt. Grace produced the necessary documents from her handbag, handing over their travel permissions and birth certificates. "Everything is here," she said, maintaining her composure. The woman examined the documents carefully, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she forced a smile. "Thank you for your patience. I'll just need to call security for a routine check." Grace raised an eyebrow but said nothing, though she felt a knot forming in her stomach. Emily and Josh shifted uneasily beside her grandma. "Is something wrong?" Emily asked quietly, her little hand slipping into Grace's. "Not at all, sweetheart," Grace reassured her, though inside she could sense the storm brewing. She had encountered situations like this before, moments when her skin color raised, silent questions that others wouldn't dare voice openly. Within minutes, two security officers approached. Their stern expressions made it clear that they weren't here for polite conversation. Grace gave them a polite nod, trying to keep the situation calm. "Good afternoon," one of the officers said curtly. "We need to ask you a few questions about your travel plans." "Of course," Grace replied evenly, though she sensed the unspoken suspicion in their voices. The officer's gaze lingered on the children. "These kids, they're traveling with you?" "Yes, they're my grandchildren," Grace answered, holding their hands more firmly. Now the second officer glanced at the documents the airline agent had provided, then exchanged a look with his partner. There was a tense pause, as though they were trying to decide whether Grace's answers satisfied them. The first officer cleared his throat. "We're going to need you to step aside for additional screening." Grace remained composed, though she could feel the rising tension from Emily and Josh. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly. The officer shrugged. "Just routine. We need to confirm everything checks out." Emily tugged on Grace's sleeve. "Why are they asking so many questions, Grandma?" "Because sometimes people get confused," Grace whispered gently, kneeling down to meet her granddaughter's eyes. "But everything's going to be just fine." Grace followed the officers to a secondary screening area, Emily and Josh clutching her hands tightly. As they walked, Grace's thoughts drifted to previous encounters, small indignities she had endured throughout her life, moments when people questioned her, doubted her capabilities, or looked at her with skepticism simply because of the color of her skin. They reached the screening station, where Grace handed over their passports. Once more the officer scanned the documents, but seemed unsatisfied. "We'll need to ask you to wait here while we verify some information." Emily's grip on Grace's hand tightened. "I don't like this, Grandma, I know, sweetheart, but we just have to be patient." Grace's voice remained calm, though she felt a flicker of anger deep inside. She knew exactly what this was, another encounter with prejudice veiled in the guise of procedure. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Grace kept her grandchildren close, whispering reassuring words to them as the officers made their calls. Her patience was tested, but she knew that losing her temper would only make things Worse, one of the officers returned his expression unreadable. "We're going to need to involve the police," he said flatly. Josh's eyes widened with fear. "The police? But we didn't do anything." Grace knelt down and embraced both children. "It's going to be okay," she murmured. "I'm right here with you." The officer's radio crackled, and within moments, 2 uniformed police officers entered the area. Grace felt the air shift, the subtle change in atmosphere when suspicion turned into accusation. "Ma'am, we're going to need to ask you some questions," one of the officer said. His tone was hard, lacking any semblance of politeness. Grace stood tall, her years of experience giving her the strength to remain composed. "I've already answered your questions. These are my grandchildren, and we're traveling together for a family vacation." The second officer, a stocky man with a harsh demeanor, folded his arms. "We'll need to confirm that with their parents." Grace's heart sank. She knew that even her calloused explanations might not be enough to dismantle the officers' preconceived notions, but she wouldn't let her grandchildren see her fear. "Not now, of course," she replied. "I'll give you their mother's number." The officer's skeptical look made it clear that he didn't believe her as Grace handed over the phone number. She noticed the way the other passengers in the area were watching, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, and a few she sensed with silent approval of the officer's actions. The moments dragged on. As the officers made their calls, Emily and Josh clung to Grace, their young faces etched with confusion and fear. Grace held them close, whispering soft reassurances. Though her mind raced, she knew this wasn't just about today. It was about all the times she had faced similar situations when society's prejudices overshadowed her identity and achievements. But she also knew that this moment, painful as it was, would not break her. As officers continued their inquiries, Grace whispered to her grandchildren, "We'll get through this, I promise." And with that, she stood tall, waiting, because she had learned long ago that patience and resolve were the most powerful tools she possessed. The atmosphere in the airport shifted quickly. Grace felt the tension building like a slow wave that was about to break. The 2 police officers who had been called for additional screening now stood before her with an air of finality. They no longer asked questions. Their expressions had hardened, their posture more aggressive. Grace held her grandchildren close, shielding them with her presence, though she knew that words alone wouldn't stop what was coming. "Ma'am," the taller of the 2 officers said, stepping closer, "we've received conflicting information about your travel plans. We're going to need to take you in for further questioning." Grace felt her breath catch for a moment, though she kept her face calm. She had dealt with countless intimidating figures in courtrooms across the country, men and women who underestimated her strength, her intelligence, but this was different. This was personal. She glanced down at Emily and Josh, who clung to her hands, their faces pale with fear. "We've already provided all the necessary documentation," Grace said, her voice steady. "These are my grandchildren. You can call their mother. She'll confirm everything." The shorter officer, a man with sharp, beady eyes, shook his head. "That's not good enough, ma'am. You're being detained for suspicion of child abduction." The words hit her like a physical blow. She took a slow breath, trying to keep her composure. Her thoughts raced. Child abduction. How had things escalated this quickly? Grace's mind flashed back to the countless cases she had overseen in her courtroom, where innocent people were unjustly accused because of the color of their skin, where assumptions were made before any evidence was reviewed. Abduction. Emily's small voice trembled. "But Grandma, we didn't do anything wrong." Grace knelt down, pulling both children into her arms. "You didn't, sweetheart, and neither did I. But we need to be brave right now, okay?" Josh's eyes were wide with fear. "Are they going to take you away?" Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. "No," she whispered fiercely, though she wasn't sure if it was the tea. "Grace, I'm not going anywhere." But even as she said it, the officers were stepping forward. The taller one took hold of Grace's arm, gripping it firmly. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." Emily and Josh cried out in protest, their small hands reaching for Grace as the officers pulled her to her feet. Grace fought to keep her voice calm. "You don't need to do this," she said, trying to reason with them. "You have my identification, the children's documents. There's no reason to treat me like a criminal." But the officers weren't listening. The shorter one yanked a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around, ma'am." Grace's heart raced. She'd seen the scene too many times on the news in her courtroom, the unjust arrest, the unnecessary force. She wanted to protest, to shout at them, but she knew it would only make things worse. So instead, she turned slowly, her eyes never leaving her grandchildren. Josh began to cry, big tears rolling down his cheeks. "Leave her alone. That's our grandma." He tried to run toward her, but one of the security officers stepped in, blocking him. "Josh, it's okay," Grace called over her shoulder, her voice as steady as she could make it. "Stay with Emily. I'll be back soon." But the children's cries were drowned out by the clicking of the handcuffs. Grace felt the cold metal bite into her wrists, and for The first time in years, she felt completely powerless, her mind whirled thinking of the time. She had used her position, her authority, to bring justice to others, and now here, she was treated like a criminal in front of her own grandchildren. The taller officer tightened his grip on her arm, pulling her toward the exit. "We'll take it from here," he muttered to the security staff who stood by watching with uncertain expressions as they led Grace through the airport. The stares of the surrounding travelers were sharp and uncomfortable. Some people whispered among themselves, their eyes following the scene with a mix of curiosity and judgment. A few held up their phones, capturing the moment on video. Grace could feel the heat of humiliation rising within her, but she forced herself to keep walking, her head held high. As they reached the main terminal, a man with a phone called out, "What's going on? What did she do?" The shorter officer shot him a glance. "Suspected abduction. We're taking her in for questioning." Grace's stomach turned as she heard the murmurs from the crowd. "Abduction? Oh, that's awful. She looks like a nice lady, but you never know." The assumptions were flying fast, just as they always did when the narrative was shaped by prejudice. Emily and Josh were still following behind, escorted by a third officer, their tear-streaked faces showing the depth of their confusion. Emily tugged at the officer. "Josh, that's our grandma. Why are you taking her?" The officer barely glanced down at her. "You'll be going with social services for now. They'll sort everything out." Emily's voice wavered. "But we don't want to go with them. We want our grandma." Grace's heart broke hearing their pleas, but there was nothing she could do. She had to stay calm for them, if not for herself. They exited the airport and reached a waiting police car. The taller officer opened the back door, roughly guiding Grace into the back seat. She winced as the handcuffs bit into her wrists. The door slammed shut, and she was left in the silence of the car, the world outside a blur through the tinted windows. Inside, Grace's thoughts raced. How could this be happening? How could things escalate so quickly, so brutally? She thought about her long career as a judge, where she had witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of systemic prejudice. But even with all her experience, all her knowledge of the law, she hadn't expected to find herself in this situation, an innocent woman being treated like a criminal simply because of the color of her skin and the assumptions that came with it. The car began to move, taking her away from her grandchildren, away from the airport. Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She couldn't let fear take over. She had to stay strong for herself, for Emily and Josh. They needed her now more than ever. But even as she tried to steady her mind, the weight of the handcuffs around her wrists and the sound of the officers' voices outside the car reminded her of the harsh reality. She was in their custody now, and until the Grace came out, until someone realized the grave mistake that had been made, she was at their mercy. The car slowed as they approached the police station. Grace opened her eyes, the station looming large in the distance. She had been in countless police stations before, but always as a judge, a figure of authority, a protector of justice. Now she was entering as a suspect, an accused kidnapper. As the car came to a stop, the door opened, and the officers roughly pulled her out. Grace spit back a cry as the handcuffs dug deeper into her skin. She felt the eyes of the officers her cold and unyielding. There was no recognition of her status, no understanding of who she truly was to them. She was just another suspect. They led her into the station, past the front desk, and down a dimly lit hallway. Grace walked with her head high, refusing to let the shame consume her. But inside, the pain was unbearable. The thought of Emily and Josh being taken by social services, scared and confused, made her heart ache. "Sit here," one of the officers barked as they shoved her onto a cold metal bench. "We'll process you soon." Grace nodded, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that in moments like these, silence was often the best defense. But deep inside, the fire of determination was already starting to burn. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The station was cold, both in temperature and atmosphere. Grace sat on the hard metal bench, her wrists still bound by the unforgiven handcuffs. She observed her surroundings as police officers walked past her, barely sparing a glance. Each one seemed indifferent, some even showing a hint of disdain. It was the kind of dismissiveness she had seen too many times, as though her humanity was of no significance. A sergeant finally approached, his gaze stern and unwelcoming. He eyed Grace with skepticism, as though he had already decided who she was before even hearing her story name. He barked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Grace Wilson," she replied, keeping her voice level and calm. She knew she couldn't afford to lose her composure. Now the sergeant gave her a cold, uninterested look. He didn't recognize the name, and why would he to him? She was just another suspect. He turned away, scribbling something on his clipboard before gesturing to a younger officer. "Take her to holding," he said dismissively. The young officer took Grace by the arm, his grip firm, as he led her down a dimly lit hallway. The air was thick with the musty scent of old concrete and the distant clanging of cell doors echoed through the narrow corridor. Grace's heart sank as they approached the holding area. She had spent her life working to keep innocent people out of places like this, and now she was the one being led in. The officer opened a metal door and gestured for Grace to step inside. The cell was small, with a simple bench and a toilet in the corner. Grace took a deep breath, stepping into the cell, the door clanging shut behind her with a resounding finality. She sat down on the bench, her mind racing. She thought of Emily and Josh, wondering if they were okay, if they understood what was happening. As she sat in the silence of the cell, the voices of the officers outside carried through the bars. Their words were low, but the disdain in their tone was clear. "I don't know why they let people like her roam around with kids like that," one of them muttered. "Yeah, probably some kind of scam," another replied. "You'd think she'd be smarter than to try it at an airport." Grace closed her eyes, the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. She had faced prejudice her entire life, but there was something uniquely painful about being accused of harming her own family. It wasn't just an attack on her character, it was an attack on the love she had for her grandchildren. The bond she had worked so hard to build time seemed to stretch endlessly. The cell was cold, and the hard bench offered no comfort. Grace's thoughts drifted to her courtroom, to the countless cases she had presided over. She remembered the young defendants, the frightened faces of those who had been wrongfully accused. She had always prided herself on being fair, on being someone who could see past assumptions and biases, and now here she was a victim of the very system she had fought to make. Just a clattering sound interrupted her thoughts. The cell door swung open, and a different officer stood there, this one older, with a weary expression. He looked at Grace for a moment, his eyes scanning her face. There was something different in his gaze, not compassion, but perhaps curiosity. "Come on," he said, his voice softer than the others. "We need to take you for processing." Grace stood, her wrists aching as she moved. The officer led her down another corridor, this one even narrower than the last. They reached a small room with a table and 2 chairs, a flickering light casting a dim glow over the space. He gestured for her to sit, then left the room without a word. "Are you?" Grace sat in silence, her mind racing. She needed to find a way to contact her lawyer, to let someone know what was happening. She knew that the longer this went on, the more traumatic it would be for Emily and Josh. They were just children. They shouldn't have to endure this kind of fear and uncertainty. The door opened again, and the Sant from earlier entered, followed by another officer. He sat across from Grace, his eyes cold and calculating. "All right, Mrs. Wilson," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Why don't you tell us what really happened at the airport?" Grace met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "I already told you. I'm traveling with my grandchildren. We were on our way to a family vacation. You have all the documents, birth certificates, travel permissions, everything is in order." The sergeant leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "You expect us to believe that a woman like you traveling with 2 white kids are going to have to do better than that?" Grace felt a surge of anger, but she forced it down, keeping her voice steady. "I am their granum. Their mother is my daughter. If you would take the time to verify the documents, you would see that everything I've said is true." The sergeant shook his head, his smirk widened. "You've got an answer for everything, don't you? But we've seen this kind of thing before, people trying to take advantage of kids, using them for who knows what." Grace's hands clenched in her lap, the handcuffs digging into her skin. "I want to speak to my lawyer," she said, her voice sharp. "I know my rights. You have no grounds to hold me here." The sergeant laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Your lawyer, huh? And who would that be? Some public defender who's going to come in here and tell us we're doing our jobs wrong?" Grace lifted her chin, her gaze never wavering. "I'm a federal judge," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "and I demand to speak to my attorney now." The sergeant's smirk faltered for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He exchanged a glance with the other officer, who shrugged. "Yeah, right," the sergeant muttered, though his tone lacked the confidence it had held before. "We'll see about that." He stood abruptly, gesturing to the other officer. "Get her back to holding. We'll deal with this later." The officer grabbed Grace by the arm, pulling her to her feet. Grace allowed herself to be led back to the cell, her mind racing. She knew that once she got in contact with her lawyer, things would change. But until then, she had to endure this, the insults, the skepticism, the cold indifference of those who saw her as nothing more than a suspect. Back in the cell, Grace sat down on the bench, taking a deep breath. She thought of Emily and Josh, of their frightened faces as she was taken away. She couldn't let this break her. She had faced worse in her life, and she had always come out stronger. This would be no different. Hours passed, the cold of the cell seeping into her bones. Grace closed her eyes, trying to focus her thoughts to stay calm. She knew that she had people who would fight for her lawyer, her colleagues, even Friends in high places who would be outraged when they found out what had happened, but for now she was alone, and she had to rely on her own strength to get through this. The door to the holding area opened, and Grace looked up to see the young officer from earlier, his expression uncertain. He approached her cell, unlocking the door. "You have a call," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace stood, her heart pounding. This was her chance. She followed the officer down the hallway to a small room. With a phone on the table, he gestured for her to sit, then handed her the receiver. Grace took a deep breath, dialing the number she knew by heart, the number of her attorney, someone she trusted implicitly. As the phone rang, she closed her eyes, focusing on the sound, willing herself to stay calm. The line clicked, and a familiar voice answered. "This is Marcus Green." "Who's calling?" "Marcus, it's Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "I need your help." There was a pause, then Marcus's voice became sharp, focused. "Grace, where are you? What's going on?" Grace took a deep breath. "I'm at the police station. They've arrested me. They think I've kidnapped my grandchildren. I need you to come here now." Marcus's response was immediate. "I'll be there as soon as I can." "Hang in there, Grace. We'll get this sorted out." Grace nodded, though he couldn't see her. "Thank you, Marcus. I know you will." As she hung up the phone, Grace felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't over yet, but at least now she had someone on her side, someone who would fight for her just as she had fought for so many others. The officer led her back to her cell, and Grace sat down once more, her resolve strengthening. She would get through this. She would see her grandchildren again, and when this was all over, she would make sure that those responsible were held accountable. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Grace sat on the cold bench, her back straight, her expression calm, but her heart was a mix of determination and fear. She had spent hours in the holding cell, and every minute that passed felt like a reminder of the injustices she had witnessed throughout her career. Yet this time, she was the victim. She had been taken from her grandchildren, treated like a criminal, her identity disregarded. But she wasn't one to give up easily, and she knew help was coming. Marcus would make sure that. Suddenly, the door to the holding area swung open, and a group of officers entered. Leading them was the sergeant who had interrogated her earlier, his face flushed, his demeanor markedly different from before. Behind him was a tall man in a suit, Marcus Green, her lawyer. His expression was a mix of anger and urgency, and Grace's heart lifted at the sight of him. The sergeant cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Wilson, you're free to go," he said, his voice lacking the cold authority it had held earlier. He gestured for the officer by the door to open Grace's cell. The metal bars swung open, and Grace stood slowly, her eyes fixed on the sergeant, who now couldn't seem to meet her gaze. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the officers. "What you've done here today is beyond unacceptable," he said, his voice sharp. "You detained a federal judge without proper cause, refused to verify her identity, and subjected her to humiliation in front of her family. There will be consequences." The sergeant swallowed, his gaze flicking nervously to Grace. "It was a misunderstanding," he stammered. "We were just following protocol." Grace raised an eyebrow, her voice calm. "But cutting protocol? Is that what you call racial profiling?" And ignoring clear evidence, she stepped out of the cell, her wrists still sore from the handcuffs. "You had all the documentation. You chose to ignore it," Marcus noted, his expression darkening. "We'll be filing a formal complaint, and rested assured this isn't over." The sergeant opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door to the Holden area opened again, and a new figure entered, a representative from the Department of Justice. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair, his face stern as he took in the scene before him. "Judge Wilson, I apologize for the treatment you've received here today," the man said, his voice filled with a GRI that commanded the room's attention. He shot a cold glance at the sergeant and the other officers. "This was a grave mistake, and we will be conducting an investigation into what happened." Grace nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you, but this isn't just about me. This is about the systemic issues that allow situations like this to happen. I've seen too many people mistreated because of assumptions and prejudices." The representative nodded solemnly. "I understand, and we're committed to addressing these issues. For now, please allow me to assist you in reuniting with your family." Grace glanced at Marcus, who gave her a reassuring nod. She took a deep breath, allowing herself to finally feel a measure of relief. "I want to see my grandchildren," she said quietly. "They must be terrified." The representative gestured for her to follow him, and they walked out of the holding area together, Marcus by her side. As they made their way through the station, Grace could feel the eyes of the officers on her, some filled with curiosity, others with shame. She kept her head high, her expression calm. She would not let them see her broken. They reached a small room near the front of the station where Emily and Josh were waiting the moment Grace stepped inside. Emily let out a cry, running towards her grandma. She sobbed, throwing her arms around Grace's waist. Josh followed, his eyes wide with tears, but his face determined. Grace knelt down, pulling both children into her arms, her own eyes misting as she held them close. "I'm here, my loves," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this. They said you did something bad," Josh said, his voice trembling, "but I knew they were wrong. You didn't do anything." Grace kissed the top of his head, her heart aching. "No, sweetheart, I didn't do anything, and I'm going to make sure that everyone knows it." Marcus watched them, his expression softening. He stepped forward, his voice gentle. "Let's get you all out of here. We have a lot of work to do, but right now you need to be with your family." Grace stood, keeping an arm around each grandchild. As they walked out of the police station, the sunlight outside was blinding after the dim interior of the building, and Grace took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air. She looked down at Emily and Josh, their faces still streaked with tears, but their expressions hopeful now. Marcus led them to a waiting car, opening the door for them. "I'll be in touch soon," he said to Grace. "We have a lot to discuss, legal action, press statements, but for now, just focus on them." Grace nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything." He gave her a small smile. "It's not over, Grace. We're just getting started." As the car pulled away from the station, Grace looked out the window, her heart heavy but resolute. This ordeal had shaken her, but it had not broken her. She thought of all the people who had faced similar injustices, people without the resources or connections. She had people who had been silenced by a system. She knew she couldn't let this end here. "Grandma," Emily said softly, breaking into her thoughts, "are we still going on vacation?" Grace looked down at her, a smile breaking through the exhaustion. "Yes, sweetheart, we are, but first we're going to make sure that what happened today never happens to anyone else again." Josh nodded, his small face determined. "You're going to make them listen, aren't you, Grandma?" Grace nodded, her heart swelling with pride for these brave children. "Yes, Josh, I am, and I'm going to make sure they listen to everyone who's been ignored for too long." She looked out the window again, the city passing by in a blur. This was just the beginning, a beginning she hadn't chosen, but one she would embrace, because if there was one thing Grace Wilson knew how to do, it was fight for justice, and this time it was personal. The car ride back home was quiet, filled with the lingering tension of what had just transpired. Grace held her grandchildren close, their small hands resting in hers. As she gazed out the window, her mind racing, the shock and humiliation of what had happened at the airport still clung to her, but there was no time to dwell on it. There was work to be done, not just for herself, but for all those who had had similar treatment and had no voice to fight back. When they arrived home, Grace was greeted by her daughter Miranda, whose face was a mixture of relief and anger. She rushed forward, pulling Emily and Josh into her arms before embracing her mother tightly. "Mom, I was so worried," Miranda said, her voice trembling. "I can't believe they did this to you." To the kids, Grace sighed, her exhaustion. "Evie, I'm all right, Miranda. And the kids are okay too. But we can't let this end here. It's not just about us, it's about the system that allows this to happen." Miranda pulled back, her eyes blazing with determination. "We're not letting it go, Mom. We're going to fight this. I've already reached out to a few reporters I know. They want to tell your story." Grace nodded, a spark of resolve lean within her. "Good. Let's make sure people know what really happened." The following morning, Grace and Miranda sat together at the kitchen table, their phones buzzing with messages from journalists and friends. Marcus had been busy overnight ensuring that the media knew what had happened. A few local news stations had picked up the story, and the first reports had already begun to circulate online. "Federal judge detained at airport, wrongfully accused of kidnapping grandchild." The headlines were damning, and the story quickly gained traction. By midday, Grace's phone was ringing incessantly. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers reached out, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of mistreatment. It was overwhelming, but Grace knew this was the kind of momentum they needed to create real change. Miranda handed Grace her phone. "It's Marcus," she said. "He wants to do a press conference." Grace took the phone, her voice steady as she spoke to Marcus. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's make sure the tea." Grace is heard. Later that afternoon, Grace found herself standing in front of a small crowd of reporters gathered outside her home. The flag flashes of cameras and the buzz of murmurs filled the air. She stood tall, her hand resting protectively on Emily's shoulder. Josh standing close by her side. Miranda was beside them, her expression fierce. Marcus stepped forward, holding up his hand to quiet the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," he began. "We are here to address the unlawful detention of federal judge Grace Wilson, who was wrongfully accused of kidnapping her own grandchildren simply because of the color of her skin. This incident is a stark reminder of the systemic biases that plague our Society biases that must be addressed and eradicated, he gestured to Grace, and she stepped forward, her gaze steady as she faced the reporters. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice clear and unwavering. Yesterday, I was treated not as a respected judge, but as a suspect, a criminal, simply because someone saw my skin color and made assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of. This kind of treatment is not new. It's something that people of color face every day, often with far worse consequences. I'm speaking out today not just for myself, but for everyone who has been mistreated, marginalized, and silenced by a system that is supposed to protect us. The reporters leaned in, their cameras clicking furiously. Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. I've dedicated my life to upholding the law, to ensuring that justice is served, but what happened to me is a reminder that our system is deeply flawed. We cannot continue to allow prejudice to dictate who is treated with respect and who is treated with suspicion. It's time for change, real change, and I intend to do everything in my power to see that change happen. The crowd erupted in questions, their voices overlapping as they called out to her. Marcus stepped forward again, raising his hands. We will be taking questions, but please one at a time. A reporter in the front row spoke up. Judge Wilson, what do you plan to do next? Are you pursuing legal action? Grace nodded, her expression firm. Yes, we are pursuing legal action. The officers involved must be held accountable for their actions, and we will be pushing for systemic reforms to prevent this from happening to anyone else. This isn't just about one incident, it's about changing the way we approach law enforcement training and accountability. Another reporter asked, do you believe this incident will have a wider impact on the conversation about racial profiling and police reform? Grace paused, her eyes meeting the reporters. I hope so. I believe that change starts with awareness. The more we bring these issues to light, the harder it becomes for people to ignore them. My hope is that by sharing my story, we can start a broader conversation about the systemic issues that affect so many people in this country. As the press conference continued, Grace felt a sense of purpose settling within her. This was her fight, now not just for herself, but for her grandchildren, for her community, for everyone who had ever been mistreated because of their race. The journey ahead would be long, but she was ready for it. That evening, Grace sat with Emily and Josh in the living room, the new playing softly in the background. The children were curled up beside her, their eyes heavy with sleep. On the screen, the story of her wrongful detention was being discussed by a panel of commentators. Grace watched as they debated the implications, some expressing outrage, others trying to downplay the incident. Emily looked up at her voice drowsy. Grandma, are they going to fix it? Are they going to make sure this doesn't happen again? Grace smiled softly, brushing a hand over her granddaughter's hair. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure they do, sweetheart. It won't be easy, but we have to try. Josh shifted, his eyes half closed. You're really brave, Grandma. You're not afraid of anything. Grace's heart swelled with love and determination. I'm only brave because I have you two by my side, she whispered, and as long as I have you, I'll never stop fighting for what's right. The children drifted off to sleep, their breaths even and peaceful. Grace looked at the screen again, her resolve hardening. This was only the beginning. The world needed to see the Tigres, and she would make sure they did, no matter how long it took, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. The press conference had done its job. The story of Grace's wrongful arrest was now national news, and the public reaction was swift and intense. Calls for accountability filled social media, and demonstrations were organized in support of Grace and others who had suffered under systemic injustice. The incident had sparked something larger, a movement demanding change. In response to the growing outrage, the police department announced an internal investigation into the officers involved in Grace's arrest. It was a small step, but it was enough to show that they were feeling the pressure. Grace knew that this was just the beginning, but it was a start. She watched from her living room as a police spokesperson addressed the media, SONF confirming that the officers had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. It's not enough, Miranda said, her arms crossed as she watched the broadcast with a frown. They're just trying to appease the public. Grace nodded. I know, but the fact that they're being forced to act at all means we're making an impact. They're realizing they can't sweep this under the rug. Marcus had been working wirelessly, coordinating with other civil rights attorneys and activists to keep the pressure on the department. Grace had been in constant contact with him, strategizing their next move. She knew they couldn't let the momentum fade. They had to ensure that real consequences followed. A few days later, Grace received a call from Marcus. The internal investigation is moving faster than we expected, he said, his voice tinged with a mix of surprise and determination. They're starting to realize just how badly they Messed up, the Department of Justice is getting involved, and it looks like there may be federal charges against the officers. Grace felt a wave of emotions, relief, vindication, and a fierce sense of justice. That's good news, she said, but we need to make sure this leads to loss and change, not just a slap on the wrist for a few individuals. Absolutely, Marcus agreed. We're drafting a formal complaint against the department, and we're going to push for broader reforms, mandatory bias training, accountability measures, the whole 9 yards. This can't just be about the officers involved in your case. It's about the entire system. Grace smiled, a sense of purpose filling her. I'm with you, Marcus. Let's do this. The pressure on the police department continued to build. News outlets ran story after story detailing the events of Grace's arrest, highlighting the failures of the officers involved and the systemic biases that had led to such an unjust situation. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on Grace's side, and as the protest grew, it became clear that the department could no longer ignore the cause for change. A week after the incident, Grace received a formal apology from the chief of police. It was delivered in person, the chief standing awkwardly in her living room, his face lined with regret. Judge Wilson, on behalf of the department, I want to sincerely apologize for the way you were treated, he said, his voice strained. It was unacceptable, and we are committed to making changes to ensure this doesn't happen again. Grace listened, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. I appreciate the apology, chief, but words aren't enough. I want to see real action, not just for me, but for everyone who has faced similar treatment. There needs to be accountability, and there needs to be change. The chief nodded, his eyes meeting hers. We're working on it. The officers involved have been placed on leave, and the investigation is ongoing. We're also reviewing our training programs and policies to address the issues that led to this situation. Grace didn't let her gaze waver. I hope you understand that this is about more than just an investigation. It's about dismantling the biases that are ingrained in the system. I want to see changes that will make a real difference in how officers interact with the communities they serve. The chief looked at her for a long moment before nodding. We will do our best, Judge Wilson, and I hope you'll hold us accountable. You can count on that, Grace replied. After the chief left, Grace sat down, her mind racing. She knew the apology was a step in the right direction, but it was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. She thought of all the people who had been mistreated by the system, those who didn't have the platform or the voice that she did. She had to make sure that what happened to her would serve as a catalyst for change. The protests continued gaining momentum as more and more people joined in. Activists and community leaders rallied together, demanding not only justice for Grace, but also brought her police reforms. The story of her wrongful arrest had become a symbol of the systemic racism that plagued law enforcement, and people were no longer willing to stay silent. One evening, as Grace was preparing dinner, the doorbell rang. Miranda opened the door, revealing a group of young activists standing on the porch. They held signs and wore shirts emblazoned with messages of justice and equality. One of them, a young black woman with determined eyes, stepped forward. Judge Wilson, she said, her voice steady, we're organizing a march next week, and we would be honored if you would join us. Your story has inspired so many of us, and we believe that your presence would make a powerful statement. Grace looked at the young woman, her heart swelling with emotion. She saw in her the same fire that had driven her throughout her career, the same desire to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. She smiled, nodding. I would be honored to join you, she said. Thank you for standing up and making your voices heard. The young woman's eyes lit up, and she extended her hand. Grace shook it, feeling a renewed sense of hope. This was what it was all about, inspiring the next generation to keep fighting, to keep pushing for change. The following week, Grace stood at the front of the march, surrounded by hundreds of people of all races, ages, and backgrounds. They held signs demanding justice, chanting as they moved through the streets. Grace walked beside the young activist, her heart filled with pride and determination. She knew the road ahead would be long, and the fight for justice would not be easy, but seeing the faces around her, the determination, the hope, she knew that they were on the right path. As they marched, Grace thought of Emily and Josh, who were watching from the sidelines with Miranda. She wanted them to see this, to understand that standing up for what was right was never easy, but it was always worth it. She wanted them to grow up in a world where they wouldn't have to fear being judged by the color of their skin, where they could be proud of who they were without hesitation. The march ended at the steps of City Hall, where a stage had been set up for the speakers. Grace was invited to speak, and as she stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on her. She took a deep breath, her voice strong as she addressed them. Today, we march not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been mistreated, marginalized, or silenced by the system. We march for justice, for accountability, and for change. This is not the end. It's just the beginning. Together we will continue to fight until every person is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. Grace stepped back, her heart swelling with hope. This was the power of unity, of standing together for what was right, and she knew that as long as they continued to fight, change was possible. The march had been a powerful moment, a tangible display of solidarity and hope, but Grace knew that true change required more than a single demonstration. It required sustained effort, policy changes, and a commitment from the Chin power to address systemic issues hidden, and she was determined to see it through. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and strategy sessions. Grace was determined to use her platform to push for meaningful reforms within the police department and beyond. Marcus had been by her side every step of the way, helping her navigate the legal proceedings and ensuring that her voice was amplified in all the right places. One morning, as Grace sat in her living room reviewing the latest draft of the formal complaint against the police department, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. "They've agreed to meet," it read. "The city officials are ready to discuss reform proposals." Grace took a deep breath, a sense of purpose filling her. This was the opportunity. They had been fighting for a chance to sit down with those in power and demand real change. She replied to Marcus, "I'll be ready. Let's make sure we're prepared." The meeting was set for the following week. Grace spent the days leading up to it preparing, meticulously going over every detail of their proposals. She wanted to ensure that their demands were clear, actionable, and impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had ever been mistreated by the system, everyone who had been denied justice because of the color of their skin. The day of the meeting arrived, and Grace walked into City Hall with Marcus by her side. They were greeted by a group of city officials, including the chief of police and several members of the city council. The atmosphere was tense, but Grace felt the quiet determination settled over her. She had faced worse than this, and she was ready. The officials gestured for them to sit at the long conference table. The chief of police cleared his throat, his expression serious. "Judge Wilson, we want to thank you for coming today. We've heard your concerns, and we're committed to finding a way forward." Grace nodded, her gaze steady. "I appreciate that, Chief. But this isn't just about words. We need to see real action that will prevent what happened to me from happening to anyone else." Marcus laid out the proposals on the table, his voice clear as he outlined their demands. Were calling for mandatory bias training for all officers, increased accountability measures, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to handle complaints against the police. "We believe these steps are crucial to addressing the systemic issues that led to Judge Wilson's wrongful arrest." The city officials listened, some nodded in agreement, others looking uncomfortable. Grace could see the hesitation in their eyes, the reluctance to acknowledge just how deeply rooted the problem was, but she pressed on, her voice unwavering. "I've dedicated my life to upholding the law," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room, "and I believe in the power of the law to protect and serve, but that protection must extend to everyone regardless of their race, their background, or their circumstances. We need to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve, and that starts with accountability and transparency." There was a long pause, the room filled with a heavy silence. Finally, one of the council members spoke up, his tone thoughtful. "Judge Wilson, your story has highlighted serious flaws in our system. We are prepared to work with you to implement these changes, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take commitment from all of us." Grace nodded. "I understand that change doesn't happen overnight, but we have to start somewhere, and we have to be willing to do the hard work to make it happen." The meeting ended on a hopeful note, with the city officials agreeing to move forward with the proposed reforms. Grace knew it was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, resistance from those who didn't want to see change, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. They were making progress, and that was what mattered. In the days that followed, the city began to take action. The officers involved in Grace's arrest were formally charged with misconduct, and the police department announced new training programs aimed at addressing bias and improving community relations. The establishment of an independent oversight committee was underway, and Grace was invited to be a part of the advisory board. Grace accepted the invitation, knowing that her work was far from over. She wanted to ensure that the changes being made were meaningful, that they would have a lasting impact. She wanted to be a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. One afternoon, as Grace sat on her porch watching Emily and Josh play in the yard, Miranda joined her, a cup of tea in hand. "You're really making a difference, Mom," Miranda said, her voice filled with admiration. "I've always been proud of you, but seeing you fight like this, it's incredible. Grace smiled, her heart swelling with love for her daughter. I'm just doing what needs to be done, she said softly, for you, for the kids, for everyone who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Miranda nodded, her eyes misting. You're making the world a better place, one step at a time. Grace looked out at her grandchildren, their laughter filling the air. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and challenges she couldn't yet foresee, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had her family, her community, and the countless people who had stood by her side throughout this journey. That evening, Grace attended a community event organized by the young activist she had marched with. It was held at a local park, with families gathered to listen to speakers share their stories and celebrate the progress they had made. As Grace took the stage, she looked out at the crowd, her heart filled with gratitude and hope. We've come a long way, she began, her voice strong, but our work is far from over. The fight for justice, for equality, is a continuous journey. It's not just about changing policies, it's about changing hearts and minds. It's about creating a world where every child, every person can feel safe, respected, and valued. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the park. Grace stepped back, her eyes shining with determination. This was her mission now, to fight for justice, to push for change, to ensure that the next generation would grow up in a world where they could thrive without fear. As the event came to a close, Grace stood with the young activist who had first invited her to march. The young woman looked at Grace, her eyes filled with admiration. Thank you for everything you've done, she said. You've inspired so many of us. Grace smiled, her heart swelling with pride. It's all of you who inspire me, she replied. Together we're making a difference, and we're just getting started. The young woman nodded, her eyes bright with hope. We won't stop until we see real change. Grace looked out at the crowd, the families, the children playing in the grass. She knew that the road ahead would be long, but she also knew that they were on the right path. And as long as they stood together, as long as they fought for what was right, there was nothing they couldn't accomplish. This was only the beginning, a beginning filled with hope, determination, and the promise of a better future. And Grace Wilson was ready to lead the way. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the bell so you don't miss new episodes. Also, check out our other videos that you might be interested in. Share in the comments what you think and where you watch us from. We're very interested in your opinion. Disclaimer: this channel is opposed to all forms of discrimination, bigotry, intolerance, and human rights violations. The narratives presented here are original works that were crafted to foster constructive dialogue, comprehension, and introspection. The production of all content is guided by a dedication to the preservation of human dignity and the respect for diversity.